record. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by sharing my screen. Okay. I should mention though, I am currently on a work laptop type thing. I am away from home. So if you do see a random stutter, that's just what it is. Okay. So don't pay too much mind to it. So here's what's going to happen. So today, movement and holding angles. What is the difference between the two? Why do you need to know both? Why are they both intertwined here? Okay. First, let's start with just understanding how each individual rank tends to hold angles and how each individual rank tends to misplace themselves crosshair wise, positioning wise, and how they tend to take fights. Okay. We're going to first grab this example by using these little rollouts over here that they're moving. And then I'm going to place down this wall. What you're going to notice is that depending on where you are, ELO wise, you're going to hold this angle a little differently. Okay. The movement that you're going to take in which you approach this angle will vary depending on where you are. Okay. I've seen a lot of different ranks that do wildly different things. Okay. And the biggest thing that really helps the approach on how you hold and how you swing has a matter of confidence that we kind of need to address in the lower elos. But they never feel confident taking that angle in the first place because they don't feel like they have the aim to back it up. Okay, so let's start with like the lower elos. This is all the way from gold all the way to iron. Okay, the only difference between them is simply the higher up you go, the better aim they have, or a little bit more game sense. But at the end of the day, they still lack some of the big requirements, like consistent crosshair placement is a good example. Okay. Another one that you might miss is how potentially they're going to hold the angle. Sometimes they hold it at such awkward angles that by the time that this guy swings, notice how they're not ready to really catch him, right? Notice how like this guy's just constantly over swinging and they need to directly land on them in order for them to get lucky, right? Notice how they keep swinging out and like the majority of the times they're not even landing on my crosshair, right? This is a good example of how movement, crosshair placement, and holding an angle all kind of tie back in together. Okay? Let's take it into higher elos. What do they do? Well, you're still going to see a little bit of that in diamond. However, they're starting to see how movement tends to affect the way that they take fights. Okay? Some might borrow from the pros and they might realize that they're better off just jiggling back and forth between the angle. Some of them might like to pick an off angle, where the second that they land in, as you can see, they're going to start landing a little bit more consistently on my crosshair, assuming they even swing. But, okay, let's say there's something like this. There's an off angle, right? A little bit of a movement is all it takes. Whereas it's something like this, I'm right too close to the wall. All they're going to do is wall bang me. Okay. It is important to discuss when you're holding angles that you understand perspectives, distances, and understanding how the way that you're holding your angle will impact your fight. Okay, so let's tackle the first one. Okay, the perspective that you're holding has to do with your character model and the character model that you're fighting. As you can see from this little glimpse right there, sometimes you might catch a little bit of the enemy's body. Okay, when you catch a little bit of that enemy's body, that means that you have the chance to shoot them before they can even see you. But what happens if they have the opposite view? How can they gain this? This has to do with how far you are from the angle or the wall that you're playing with. So let's say I want to place down this wall right here. The farther I am from the wall, the much of a bigger chance I have in catching this opponent and being able to see them before they see me. Okay. When you're bringing movement into this, you can actually use movement to properly gauge, the distance that you're playing with, okay? And probably even position yourself in a place where you have an easier chance of fighting, okay? It is good to note that when you're using movement, a lot of players think that just because they have bigger distances, they can just start doing something like this, okay? If I had a little guide, what I'm basically doing, I'm pressing W and D at the same time, okay? Can someone tell me why W and D is not a good way to approach an angle? Or WA. I'm basically moving diagonally.
On their screen, you're moving way slower.
Okay, good. So if I'm moving from farther away and I'm approaching an angle, You're right. I am moving way slower. What's another one? Let's say the fight started to happen. What's going to occur?
Coach Crow एक different game head coach आणि मग त्याच्या आतमध्ये असलं for example
What's our? Okay. So I don't think he's trying to respond. Okay. So a good answer for this would be simply when you're trying to move, this is the big mistake you start seeing up in Diamond. Again, this is something that you've seen like quite before, but in Diamond, it starts becoming a lot more prominent. Okay. When you're moving and you're using both of these keys, when you try to stop, okay, you're going to see that little thing right there. Okay. That's movement there. And it usually happens because players don't tend to be using dead zoning to their advantage or counter strafing or anything of that matter. And they're basically using two movement keys to approach an angle. As you can see, that was around that area over there and it landed in the body. That's basically what happens when you're using two keys at the same time. You can fix this by getting the distance you want.
Barrier created.
And essentially taking the fight from farther away. Okay? Taking the fight you want and only moving A and D. If you watch anybody that, you know, looks like they know what they're doing, every single time they're taking a fight, they're moving like this. They're not moving like this. Right? They're not putting A and D. They're not putting W and D. Or they're not moving diagonally across into an angle like this. Rather, you notice that they're taking an angle. They're making sure that they're farther away from the angle. And then they just approach it using one of the directional keys, either A or D. Okay? This is how movement tends to impact a lot of players. Okay? And this is how you see how most of the time when they approach an angle and they're trying to catch someone off guard, okay? When they do something like this, they're not going to be ready. Okay? Let's say I wanted to hit that guy. Well, it wasn't even close. Right? So that's one of the biggest problems when it comes to perspective. Okay? Because they're trying to incorporate this movement and they're trying to move back and forth sometimes and they're not really applying the concepts of how A and D are different than that of S and W. Okay? So point number one is simply put, perspective-wise, make sure you're farther from the wall if you're trying to slowly approach an opponent. But make sure that you're not doing it diagonally. Okay? If you're ready to take a fight, stop pressing W. Take a moment and hold that angle. This is great because I've noticed that for players that actually incorporate this, they gain two things. The first one is timing, and the second one is they get to hold an angle with a slightly bigger advantage. Because as you can tell, you might have seen some of the pro players that tend to do something like this, where they're basically jiggling around a corner. What they're doing is simply, they're making sure that they're checking around the corner, right? Making sure that there's no one there, but all they're doing is moving A and D. Okay? Does that make sense? Does the idea of A and D make sense? Does the idea of the perspective in which you're holding make sense? And does it even add to the point of simply just holding not too close? Any questions from that?
Wait, so if you hold, what's it called? Yeah, like Sage Wall, please. And then if you're doing the 80 peak and if you're trying to peek close to the wall, are you at a disadvantage or like an advantage?
If you're too close to the wall?
Yes.
Notice this guy right here. Notice how I can see him. He can't see me. He's at a disadvantage.
Okay.
Okay. This is why I had to bring in the idea of perspectives. Okay.
Okay. Makes sense.
So ideally, you want to make sure that you're taking those angles. Sorry, what's up?
Can I mention something on top of that?
Yeah, sure.
When you're peeking from closer, if you swing out, you're exposing yourself to a lot more angles than if you like slow peek from further away. That's one thing.
That is actually a really good point to make. So let's say, for example, you're here. You want to clear this angle right there. I find that a lot of players tend to do this, right? Notice how much they're exposing themselves to.
Oh, yeah.
Jiggling allows you to be able to clear those angles a lot more effectively. Okay?
Thank you.
No worries. Okay, so basically we've tackled basically the difference between, let's say, diamonds to all the way down to like golds and irons and whatnot. Okay, so what about a little bit higher up? What is the difference between an ascendant and a diamond? Well, a lot of players are going to start finding that aim is becoming more dominant. Okay, how does that movement in between the way that you hold an angle and the way that you peek, how does that influence the way that you take the fight? So, one thing that you're going to notice about the way that ascendants tend to play, okay, they love to ego, okay? And I'm not just talking about ego swinging, long swings, popping swings. I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about just taking the angle. I'm talking about how most of the time, they'll take an angle that is so unfavorable to them, right, that the only objective is to be able to flick between 1 and then 2, right? They don't put themselves in a position where they can play around the 2 different angles, okay? They don't even tend to move. They just do like tiny little jitter steps. They don't put themselves in different positions when they're taking multiple fights. In fact, I would even say that a lot of you think that you guys can win like this fight right here, right? All you need to do is just kind of do this little bit of a swing, a little bit of a jiggle, and you're good, right? That's not how it works, unfortunately. Most of the time, positioning is king when it comes to taking fights. And in the off chance that you do catch yourself in a 2v1, I suggest that you guys pay attention to what the higher elos are doing, okay? You should never do this. Never go for like a flick randomly, okay? I find that a lot of players do this and then they start crouching immediately. Or they'll do this and then they start doing this, right? Don't just do that. It places you in one spot, okay? So movement-wise, it's not going to really give you much. So let's say, for example, I was holding this angle, okay? How would I take multiple fights? Well, ideally, what you're going to do is you're going to try to isolate fights. Notice how as I am isolating fights, notice how I am taking different angles. Notice how I'm pushing myself farther away from the wall, okay? Notice how my crosshair placement is indicative of where I'm trying to fight. I am pre-aiming my area to make sure that I can hit the guy that I'm trying to kill. Right? I'm not just simply going for fights like this where I'm trying to get those flicks all the time. Okay? This happens a lot. This is actually where I catch most ascendants struggling. In fact, I've seen so many rounds lost because they put themselves in open areas, or they don't think about their position, or they don't think about the long-term consequences of the fights that they're about to take in the long term. Planning is essential when you're about to take that fight. Okay? So if you're looking at an angle, you got to think about how many fights am I going to take here? A good example is Lotus, okay? You guys know the tree area, right? The tree area, door opens and closes, okay? Start thinking ahead. Is there anything that can challenge me here? How are they going to challenge me? So for example, if they have an omen, they can easily flash you. So they can approach you at a faster pace, and now you have to take multiple fights. Okay, so when you're holding an angle, now it's not just simply just isolating fights. It is about thinking about utility. It's thinking about how I'm going to space myself between everybody else. Because if they all start swinging me at once, then I'm put in that position where I'm asked to basically do this flick. Okay, sure, you can hit it sometimes. You cannot hit it sometimes. In order for you to climb, you need to be consistent. And that's the goal of this. Okay, so what can you do? What are the higher players doing? What are they trying to do? Well, to put it simply, most Radiants, when I watch them play, they already have that flick down. They know they can hit that flick. They've not questioned whether they can hit that flick or not. Okay? Most of the time, they're pretty controlled. It is pretty different, however, how they approach the flick. When you see people flicking, they just think it's between 1 and then 2. That's it. They think that's the flick and they think that's everything. Okay? When you take 2 fights, both of the targets are going to be aiming at this exact spot that you're playing. Okay, regardless of the distance. What I've seen players do is, when they peek, they basically take fight number 1, and if they find the second guy and they're on cover, what are they going to do? Are they going to take another fight like this, or are they going to go back into cover? Right? It's pretty obvious. They're going to go back into cover and then isolate the second fight. What I find that they do when they're caught in the open, in those scenarios that I talked about, and it's just not just a matter of, right? It's not just a spray transfer. Sure, there are situations where those will happen, okay? It is not rare. It does happen. Not every player tries to be pro. But what I do notice is that those that are consistent have a little bit of movement tech. What they do is, they know they can hit this flick. But what they do instead is they like to formulate around basically juking this guy. The fight is already prepared for this guy. How can they deal with this guy? Okay. Sometimes the angle matters, but most of the time it's something as simple as just fighting on their offside. Okay. So what does that mean? Most of the time players tend to be either one side or the other. It's really hard to tell which side is best, but you can just take a little bit of a 50-50. What does that mean? Sometimes you can see that when I'm trying to flick between right and left, I might be consistent, but left and right, I might not. Okay. This is what basically they're going to do. They're going to take the first fight, and then they're going to move and then take the second fight. Okay. It is not a novel concept. Okay. You're going to find that a lot of players think that they can just hit this flick, and they tend to just do this. They tend to just do like tiny little movements. Okay. Most players think that you have to be doing these big flicks. You don't. All you have to do is hit one and then prepare yourself for the other. What I found that most of the time they do is they choose like a big step. I don't know if you've noticed from my character model. Okay. There's a little bit of a sway. The character model essentially shows one step. When it goes all the way down and all the way up, that's a step. They choose to do one step and then they take the second fight. I've found in most instances when they're taking a double fight, one of them is either going to crouch or one of them is going to stay in one spot. And that's it. That is the only difference. That is the only difference I've seen from higher level aiming, higher level fights. Okay. They simply don't try to rush to the second fight. They take their time, because here's the deal. And this is what you guys need to understand. If you get caught in a 2v1, you might already have lost. Okay. But the only thing that's stopping you from winning that fight is how patient you are in taking that fight. Okay. If you are doing this and you're not, like, even there, I didn't even hit it. Okay. If you're taking that fight and you're rushing yourself through it, okay, then what's going to happen? You're going to lose. I'd rather you guys take your time, put yourself in a situation where you're good at just preparing yourself to take those fights. Okay. If the targets are like right next to each other, sure, I guess you might as well flick. But most of the time, they're not going to just line up for you. Okay. Especially if they know how to position. Okay. So what I prefer that you guys do is that you guys figure out the targets that you guys are going to fight and try to learn this movement. Okay. This movement is by no means hard, but implementing it in a game is much more difficult than you think. Okay. This is why I still see things like, right? I see stuff like that all the time. Okay. No matter the elo, I still see it. It's panic. You guys need to control that panic. Okay. So how does that tie into something like holding an angle? How does that tie into movement? Well, simply, we've already talked about that perspective shift. We've already talked about how the way that you're holding, how close, how far, you know, how you approach the angle changes. Notice how I never told you guys to change W or D. Sorry, W or S. Notice I didn't ask you guys to do this. I just asked you to move to the right or to the left. That's it. So, how can you practice these skills for later games? Well, there's some ways that you just can, and sometimes you can't, but this is what I need you guys to do. The first thing that you guys need to practice, okay, is being able to understand that when you're holding an angle right here, okay, you need to understand the distance at which this guy is going to swing out. You also need to understand how your reaction time affects all of this. If you're 25, old, and withering just like me, then it's very unlikely that you're going to be able to just hold this angle like this all the time. Okay? You're going to notice very consistently, they always overstep. Okay, let's say this guy over here, hopefully he oversteps. Well, I'm even missing at that point, but that's the point simply being, oh, there it is. He overstepped. Okay, most of those fights tend to just be quick, and they look quick on your end simply because of ping, simply of how the game works. But in reality, all they're doing is this. They're just stopping after that. It looks like they're moving fast. It looks like they already knew where you were. Okay. Dead zoning has a lot to do with that. Okay. Does anyone here know what dead zoning is? Anybody want to take a gander at what it is before I explain it? It's one of the last few concepts that we need to cover today.
I think. Go ahead. You go ahead.
Peeking on someone when you know exactly where they are.
That's a really good try. That is pre-aiming. So pre-aim would be something like I know where they are and I'm aiming right there, right? Like I'm aiming at the wall and I'm pre-aiming.
Is this a good place for someone who's somewhat a beginner, aka just started yesterday, to be?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, this is like still a movement, concept that you still need to learn in the future. So you might as well just adapt it now. Simply put, just remember when you're taking fights, A and D, try to master those. Okay. So let's just really quickly go over dead zoning. Dead zoning is, I'm not really sure where the term came from, but it became really popular. Okay. When counter strafing was a thing, people noticed that as you move left and right, okay, there's a little bit of a period in which when you transition from one to the other, okay, you're still fully accurate. Okay. So a good way to dead zone is basically to realize, hey, look at the top right. You're going to see something that says shooting error. Okay. You're going to see that I'm still moving, but you're going to see that most of the time, except for that one, I'm just pretty much accurate still. Okay. So what players tend to do is they tend to use that concept to essentially just quickly approach a target. So with dead zoning in mind, how do you hold this angle? Okay. Well, they can just very quickly just swing back and forth. Okay. I need you two to ask these questions. Let's say, for example, someone is ready to push me from here. Okay. Well, this one's pretty simple, right? They only have this much to push me from. So if he swings this way, I know that he's going to be doing a wider swing. So I can just wait back and forth and wait for him to do a wider swing. But what if I was holding something like a guy that was over here? Do I know if he's going to do a wider swing? Do I know if he's going to be doing a shorter swing? How do I prepare for that? Right? Off angles really do tend to help a lot of the situations where you tend to just hold a tighter angle and you hold for the wider area of the angle. So a good example of this would be if they take this angle, he's not going to see me. I'm not going to see him. If he takes this angle, he's not going to see me. I'm not going to see him. But he ends in the wider end. I'm going to see him. And I'm going to have an angle prepared right for him. Okay. So let me just re-explain this concept because it just felt a little confusing there to explain. In order for you guys to hold angles, you guys need to understand that movement does encompass how they approach the angle. So you know that they're going to be using, okay, A and D. In order for you guys to properly hold this angle, in order for you guys to be able to be prepared for this angle, okay, be aware of the perspective that they have, okay? Are they really close? Will you be able to see them before, before they see you? Do you know if they're walking slowly? Do you know if they already know if you're there? Okay, if they know you're there, then that means they're going to try to take that fight like I just showed you. That dead zoning. Right? Should you prepare for that dead zone? For that little counter strafe? Or are they just doing a wide swing to clear? If they're doing a wider swing to clear, then at that point in time, you can start preparing ahead of time and start holding wider. Most of the time, as a rule of thumb, I tell players that regardless of your skill level, you start simply by holding wider, as these angles right here are not going to really help you in most situations. These angles right here only work if you know the enemy doesn't know you're there. Okay? Because most of the time, they're going to do a much wider swing and you're holding way too close for the target to hit. Another example. If they're farther away, notice how if I hold for someone that is right there, you can just keep swinging, right? So ideally, you're trying to hold for the wider angle most of the time. Okay. That is something that you guys can take into your games. I suggest that you practice. The wider you hold, try to make sure that sometimes the farther you are from the wall that you're playing with, maybe you move a little bit more into an off angle. Okay. Try to practice just, being directionally adjacent to maybe, I don't know. Let's just see. What's a good example of this? Okay. Make sure you have a diagonal point between yourself and a wall. Okay. Let's just put it like that. Okay. Does anyone have any questions about the last little bit? About holding, about speeds, about where a potential person might swing, maybe dead zoning? Any questions?
Can we get like a 5-second brief example and brief explanation on dead zoning, because I didn't get it?
Oh, okay. Sure. When the game first came out, okay, a lot of players were using something called counter strafing. Historically speaking, it is basically something that comes from CSGO, CS2. The action is simply you press one key, and then you use another key to essentially stop. Okay? What you're going to notice is, I don't know if you can see my crosshair. You see how it goes from square to cross, right? Do you see that?
No.
Do you not see the crosshair moving?
No, I do.
Okay. So basically what's happening is when I stop right there, this is considered a counter strafe. It is something that was pretty essential in the game until most players started realizing that the movement is much slower. Okay. So you can actually stop way before you even need a counter strafe. So dead zoning essentially works in the concept of when you move left and right, you have a little bit of a period in which you move from the other end to from one end to the other. And you're still consistent. Okay. Your shots are still hitting where you want them to hit. And the whole purpose of it is simply to stay accurate, but at the same time, stay moving. Okay. Most experts will tell you, you know, you want to make sure that you can keep a much faster speed when you're counter strafing or dead zoning. Okay. Dead zoning is essentially just, you're still going to look like you're moving, but you're going to basically stop and you're going to be able to take a shot. Does that make sense? Or would you like me to take another example into it?
So it's basically like you hold one key down and then you
And then you
press
tap
the
the
other
other.
and hold it.
Yeah, you just tap it.
But then wouldn't you go back to going the way that you were originally going if you just tap it?
Ah, and that's the really cool thing about counter strafing, you see. When you're playing and you press the opposite key, it just stops you because it basically counteracts the speed that you were playing at. It is a mechanic that was just implemented into the game. Okay. Whether people think that it is useful or not, that's completely just optional. But it is something that you can still use. Okay. It's essentially just tap to the other. You don't have to hold the other. Okay. As you're doing this, you're going to see that if you can see the crosshair, I wish you guys could see the crosshair. Can you guys see the crosshair actually? Can anyone tell me if you guys can see the crosshair?
I can see it. It's
I
just
can
really
see
small.
it.
You can't
It's
see it
just-
moving.
I can see it.
Yeah.
It's just really small.
Okay, let's use this one for example. Can you see this better?
Yeah.
Okay. So basically what's happening is, notice how the cross is much bigger. Okay. Do you see those movements right there? You're going to notice that as I switch back and forth, the cross goes into complete neutral, as if I was standing still. That little bit right there is dead zoning. What most players tend to do is they tend to use this to swing around corners, and they take their fight once the cross is fully accurate. Okay.
All right. Thank you. Thank you.
No worries. I mean, I hope that explained it. It's one of those concepts that when you get used to this game, it'll makes a lot of sense. Okay. Take your time. You will master it in no time. Any other questions? Anything else about the topic we've covered today? Okay. We have 30 minutes. Okay. Like I said, after that, we're going to be jumping into more consultation, if anything. From aim training to whatever you guys need. And then after the 30 minutes have passed, okay, or within the 30 minutes, I don't know, depending on whether a lot of people want it or not, I'm going to start pinging for scrims. So if you weren't here for the scrim last time, you will definitely be able to enter this time. And if you're not interested, then that's completely fine. Okay. Let me close this.